There was a season when the voice that thundered from Spurgeon's pulpit disappeared. No whisper, no warmth, no sense of divine nearness, only silence. He would step onto the platform before thousands, his hands trembling, his heart hollow. The preacher who once declared, "The heavens are not brass," now looked up and heard nothing but his own echo. It was as though heaven had closed its mouth. These were the silent years of Spurgeon, not marked by scandal or sin, but by the mysterious mercy of a God who hides to be sought. Spurgeon himself wrote, "There are times when the Lord seems to have withdrawn his light, and yet it is in that darkness we learn to see by faith." He had preached faith to millions. Now he was forced to live it in the dark. For months, he could not feel God. His prayers seemed to vanish before reaching the ceiling. The scriptures, once alive in his hand, lay cold upon the page. His own sermons mocked him. Every truth he had proclaimed now returned to test him. The silence was not punishment, it was purification. He had spent years preaching that faith is believing God when you cannot trace him. Now, that line was no longer theology, it was survival. This is where true faith is born, not in the noise of revival, but in the hush of absence. Not when God explains himself, but when he conceals himself. Job knew that place. I go forward, but he is not there. Yet he knows the way that I take. David knew it too. Why are you so far from helping me? Every saint who ever glowed with light first walked through a night where God said nothing. Spurgeon's silence was holy ground. He began to understand that the God who hides his voice is not absent. He is near in a different way. He is not speaking through sound, but through stillness. Not teaching by sermon, but by silence. It was there that Spurgeon learned to worship without stimulus, to trust without proof, to love God for who he is, not for what he gives. He later wrote, "When I cannot see him, I rest in the fact that he sees me. I will trust his heart when I cannot hear his voice." This was faith stripped of music, applause, and assurance. The kind of faith that can only survive when everything else dies. The wellness gospel tells you that silence means distance. The true gospel tells you that silence means depth, because God often hides to heal. He withdraws to wean. He removes his felt presence to replace shallow feeling with solid faith. The same hands that silence your comfort are the hands that strengthen your soul. And that is why Spurgeon's fire did not die in the dark. It deepened. The silence did not suffocate him. It refined him. His sermons after that season carried a gravity that no applause could create. The man who once shouted now whispered, and heaven listened. The greatest revelation of his ministry came not when God spoke through him, but when God stopped speaking to him. That is how faith is forged, in the soundless hours where you realize that his presence is not a mood, it is a master. So if heaven feels quiet, do not panic. You are standing where prophets learned patience, where saints were sanctified, where Spurgeon himself was remade. Faith is not the ability to hear God, it is the courage to wait for him. And in that waiting, you will find that silence is not God's absence, it is his invitation. If this message echoes something you've lived, tell us in the comments what city and country you're watching from. Someone else in the silence needs to know they're not alone. Every silence from God is a classroom. And for Charles Spurgeon, this classroom had no windows, no light, and no sound, only faith and waiting. At first, he tried to escape it. He read more scripture, prayed longer prayers, preached with greater passion. But nothing changed. The heavens remained quiet. The more he knocked, the thicker the silence became. That's when he realized this wasn't a wall, it was a workshop. Spurgeon was being taught a language that only silence can teach. The vocabulary of trust, the grammar of surrender. He had to learn how to believe without hearing, how to obey without feeling, how to love without reward. He later confessed, "In those days, I learned more of my Lord's faithfulness than in all the years of sunlight." The silence was not God's cruelty, it was his curriculum, because faith that depends on noise is still immature. It clings to evidence, to emotion, to experiences. But the faith that survives silence becomes unshakable. It learns that God's voice is not the foundation of belief. His character is. That was the lesson of the silent years. God was teaching Spurgeon not how to preach faith, but how to live it. He began to notice something profound. While the voice of God had gone quiet, the hand of God had not stopped moving. Provision still came, grace still sustained, the word still illuminated, not like a sunrise, but like a candle in the dark. That is how faith grows, not by sight, but by survival. Silence exposes what sermons cannot, who you truly trust when your theology is tested by reality. Spurgeon would later tell his congregation, when you cannot hear the shepherd's call, keep walking in the direction of his character. That is the anchor in seasons of absence, what you know about God when you feel nothing from God. Job once said, "He knows the way that I take." Notice, Job didn't say, "I know the way he takes." In the silence, God keeps his direction hidden, but his eye upon you. The test of faith is never whether you understand his plan. It's whether you still believe in his goodness when you don't. For Spurgeon, this silence became sacred. It burned away his dependence on feeling and left only dependence on Christ. It taught him that ministry cannot run on momentum, only on mercy. He began to write differently, pray differently, even preach differently. The fire remained, but it was quieter, steadier. His words were no longer sparks, they were embers. And that's what the silence of God does. It changes the tone of your faith. You stop shouting to be heard and start whispering because you trust. It is in that whisper that the Spirit begins to form something eternal. The wellness gospel promises a God who always explains, but the cross reveals a God who often hides. Even Christ cried, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Yet that silence was not abandonment. It was atonement. The Son's silence bought our access. The Father's silence taught the world what love costs. So if heaven feels mute, remember this: silence is not proof of God's absence. It is a mirror of Calvary. Faith is not proven by how loudly you hear, but by how long you stay. That is what Spurgeon learned in the School of Silence, that a God who hides his voice is not punishing his servant. He is perfecting his hearing. Because sometimes the greatest sermon God will ever preach to you is the one he never speaks out loud. In the next part, we'll walk deeper into this valley, when Spurgeon's silence turned into suffering, when even his body began to break, and yet the flame of trust refused to die. The silence did not stay spiritual. It began to seep into Spurgeon's body, into nerves, bones, and blood. The preacher who once thundered from the pulpit now trembled in pain. His voice, once a flood of power, weakened into a whisper. Guilt ravaged his limbs, neuralgia gripped his nerves, and the weight of depression pressed on his mind like a dark ocean. The silence of God had now taken form in his flesh. He wrote, "I could weep by the hour, like a child who knows not why he cries." He was no longer only the prince of preachers, he had become the student of suffering. Yet even here, even in agony, he discerned the hand of a teacher. God whispers to us in our pleasure, he said, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. That pain became the new language of heaven. It wasn't punishment, it was participation. For years, Spurgeon had preached about the fellowship of Christ's sufferings. Now in sleepless nights and weary bones, he began to understand it. He discovered that God's silence and man's suffering often share the same purpose: to strip away every false reliance until faith becomes the only thing left standing. His sermons from that season changed tone. They were no longer polished gems of theology. They were wounds turned into words. The pulpit became his therapy and his cross. When people looked at him, they didn't see a man on fire with eloquence. They saw a man surviving by grace. His weakness became his witness. That's how Spurgeon learned what the Apostle Paul meant when he said, "My strength is made perfect in weakness." The very things that humiliated him became holy tools in God's hand, and that is what pain does when you let it teach you. It sanctifies what it cannot explain. The wellness gospel cannot comprehend this. It insists that divine favor means the absence of suffering. But heaven defines favor differently. It is not freedom from pain, but faithfulness through it. Spurgeon's silence had become a symphony of surrender. He realized that the God who hides his voice in peace will reveal his presence in pain. That even when heaven closes its mouth, it never turns its face. In those long nights of illness, he would lie awake whispering scripture to himself. Verses he had once preached now preached back to him. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. When I am weak, then am I strong. The Lord will perfect that which concerns me. Each verse was a flicker of fire in the darkness. He began to understand that suffering doesn't silence God. It silences us long enough to hear him again, because there are lessons too holy for noise, revelations too sacred for crowds, graces too weighty for words. The preacher who had once filled London with sound was now being shaped by stillness. The voice that moved nations was being remade in weakness. He would later tell his students, "You will never know that Christ is all you need until Christ is all you have." That line didn't come from intellect, it came from infirmity. From the nights when his tears soaked the same Bible he could barely read, pain became his pulpit. Silence became his sanctuary, and though his body faltered, his faith began to roar. Quietly but unmistakably, the God who once seemed far away was now nearer than ever. Not in thunder, but in touch. Not in triumph, but in tenderness. That's when Spurgeon realized the same fire that once filled his sermons was now burning through his suffering. The silence had not been the end of faith. It was its rebirth. In the next part, we'll see how this silent suffering became the foundation of Spurgeon's most powerful revelation. That God's hiddenness is not his absence, but his artistry, and how he forges saints in the dark to shine in the light. Spurgeon began to realize that silence was not the absence of God's voice, it was the shape of his hand. Every unanswered prayer, every quiet dawn, every sleepless night was a sculptor's chisel. Cutting away what could not stand eternity, he wrote, "The Lord is not idle when he is silent." Those words came not from comfort, but from clarity, the realization that God's hiddenness is not inactivity, but intimacy disguised. The silence was not God leaving the room. It was God working behind the curtain. In the bright days of ministry, Spurgeon had seen the crowds, the conversions, the applause. But in the silent nights, he saw the artist. He saw a God who works not on stages but in souls. A God who molds his servants in mystery so they might minister with mercy. The same hands that had once sent him fire were now shaping him through shadow. He began to compare the silence of God to the patience of a painter. The brush pauses before the next stroke, not because the work is forgotten, but because the artist is thinking. The delay is part of the design. God, Spurgeon said, is a deliberate artist. He never hurries his masterpieces. That line reveals everything he learned in those years. The pauses of heaven are not mistakes. They are moments of preparation. In that stillness, Spurgeon learned to stop asking why and start asking what now. He discovered that the point of silence is not to confuse the saint, but to craft him. Every silence was chiseling pride. Every delay was deepening dependence. Every dark night was adding weight to his words. The God who hid his voice was not abandoning him. He was adorning him with humility, endurance, and compassion that sermons alone could never teach. That is why Spurgeon's later ministry carried a tenderness absent in his early years. He no longer preached from the mountain but from the valley. His theology still burned hot, but now it glowed with empathy. His sermons sounded less like declarations and more like invitations. The silence had given him a second language, one not learned in seminary but in sorrow. He began to preach as a man who had met mystery and survived it. His listeners could feel it. They no longer heard only doctrine. They heard devotion refined by fire. This is the paradox of the divine artist. He wounds to refine, withholds to reveal, and silences to strengthen. Isaiah said, He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. The craftsman sits, not pacing, not anxious, because he knows what the heat is for. He watches the metal until his own reflection appears. Only then does he remove it from the fire. That is what God was doing with Spurgeon. The silence was not a punishment. It was a mirror being polished until it could reflect heaven clearly. The preacher who once begged for God's voice began to thank him for his quiet. He understood that faith forged in fire speaks louder than eloquence ever could. He told his congregation, "If you are God's child, you are his workmanship, and art takes time. The world loves speed. Heaven values substance. The Spirit is not in a hurry because he works with eternity in mind. So when God hides, do not assume he has stopped. Assume he is shaping. The pauses of God are not pauses in his purpose. The silence of God is not neglect. It is narrative. He is not withholding sound. He is building story. And when the time is right, when the vessel is ready, when the character can carry the calling, the voice returns. Spurgeon emerged from that season, not with explanations, but with endurance. His silence became his sermon. His pain became his pulpit. He was not merely preaching truth anymore. He was truth refined by trial. In the next part, we'll see how that refinement began to bear fruit, how the Spurgeon, who walked through silence, returned to the pulpit with a new voice, not of certainty, but of compassion. The preacher who once spoke for God now spoke like God, with grace, weight, and wounds. When the silence finally lifted, Spurgeon's voice did not sound the same. It was softer, slower, and heavier, as though every word now carried the weight of what it had survived. Before, his sermons had thundered like a storm. Now they glowed like a furnace. The tone had changed because the man had changed. His confidence was no longer in eloquence, but in endurance. His certainty was not in how clearly he heard God, but in how faithfully God had kept him when he couldn't. The silence had turned the preacher into the message. He told his congregation, "I have learned to kiss the waves that throw me against the rock of ages." It was not poetry, it was autobiography. He had wrestled the waves and lived to bless them. The world saw a preacher restored. Heaven saw a servant reborn. His ministry after the silent years had a different fire, not the blaze of performance, but the burn of compassion. He spoke less about the power of the Christian and more about the patience of Christ. He no longer tried to rescue souls with volume. He reached them with vulnerability. When Spurgeon spoke of faith now, it was not theory, it was testimony. He had felt what it meant to believe in the dark. He could look into the eyes of the doubter and say, "I know." That simple confession became his most powerful sermon. Because the world does not need perfect voices, it needs purified ones. He often said, "The anvil of affliction is a far better teacher than the book of theology." And his congregation believed him. They had seen their pastor bleed and still bless. They had watched him stagger into the pulpit, body weak but spirit blazing, and they recognized something divine in that contradiction. Weakness had made him believable. Suffering had made him safe. Silence had made him sound like God. The fire that once fueled his rhetoric now fueled his mercy. He became more patient with the struggling, gentler with the fearful, more compassionate toward those who doubted. He had learned that a bruised reed is not useless. It is simply proof that God touches gently, and this gentleness carried power. Because mercy preaches louder than mastery. When Spurgeon returned to preaching, after one of his longest bouts of illness, the congregation described a strange hush. There were no shouts, no theatrics, just a man standing with tears in his eyes, opening the word as though it were oxygen. He began by reading Isaiah 42:3, "A bruised reed he will not break." Then he paused and whispered, "I am that reed." The room broke, not from noise, but from reverence, because in that moment, the congregation saw what God had been doing all along, turning a preacher into a portrait of grace. Spurgeon's voice had become a vessel of empathy. His sermons were no longer aimed at sinners alone, but at sufferers. He began to speak to the faint-hearted, the doubting, the burned out. He preached not only for repentance, but for restoration. And yet the authority in his tone only deepened, because authority born from pain cannot be faked. His compassion didn't dilute conviction, it distilled it. That is what happens when God returns your voice after silence. It carries both thunder and tears. It confronts and comforts in the same breath. Spurgeon no longer feared losing his voice again. He knew that even if heaven went quiet once more, the silence would not destroy him. It would deepen him, because once you've met God in the dark, you stop fearing the night. The fire of eloquence had burned out. The fire of intimacy had taken its place. He had become what every believer is meant to be. A voice refined by silence. A witness that whispers louder than it shouts. In the next part, we'll see how this new voice began to spread, how Spurgeon's personal transformation birthed revival, and how God used his wounds to heal an entire generation of weary souls. Revival didn't come to London with trumpets. It came quietly, in tears, in prayer, in the trembling voice of a preacher who had learned to trust God's silence. When Spurgeon returned to the pulpit after the long years of darkness, he did not announce a movement. He simply opened his Bible and spoke like a man who had survived the fire, and yet something invisible began to move. People who had grown numb to religion started weeping again. Hardened men bowed. Cold churches came alive. No great campaign, no sensational publicity. Only the residue of a soul that had walked through absence and come out aflame. This was revival without spectacle, the revival that whispered. The Metropolitan Tabernacle filled to overflowing once more, not because the sermons were louder, but because the Spirit was nearer. Spurgeon's quietness became his anointing. His vulnerability became his authority. His weakness became a doorway through which others saw the strength of God. He would later say, "I did not bring them to Christ by thunder, but by tears." That was the miracle. The fire had returned, but now it burned differently. It didn't scorch. It sanctified. It didn't dazzle. It drew. Those who entered the tabernacle described the atmosphere not as exciting, but holy. A sacred hush often settled over the crowd before he even began to speak. It was as if the silence that had once haunted Spurgeon now filled the room as a presence. That's what happens when the preacher stops performing and starts embodying. The Spirit recognizes himself and moves freely. This was not the revival of noise, but of nearness. Not a movement of numbers, but of mercy. And mercy spreads faster than fire. Soon, letters poured in from all over England, testimonies of lives changed by words that carried no drama, only depth. Men wrote, "I heard my own pain in his voice." Women said, "He spoke as if he had read my heart." Even unbelievers came out of curiosity and left in tears. Spurgeon called it a contagion of compassion. He had discovered that tenderness could reach places truth alone could not. This was the theology of the torn, the power of a man who had bled in private, now binding wounds in public. The revival that followed his silence had no name, no slogan, no strategy. It was a movement of broken people touched by a broken preacher serving a healing God. Every sermon felt like a conversation between weakness and grace. Every prayer felt like an echo from eternity. Every altar call felt like an invitation, not a command. He no longer shouted about hell to frighten men into heaven. He wept about grace until they longed for it. That shift transformed the entire tone of evangelical preaching in England. Ministers stopped mimicking eloquence and started imitating authenticity. The nation's pulpits began to sound less like courts of judgment and more like homes of redemption. And that is the paradox of divine power. God used one man's silence to teach a generation how to hear again. The revival that whispered became a ripple that still moves through history. It outlived its preacher because what begins in humility never dies in noise. Spurgeon's flame spread because it was fueled by something no persecution could quench: compassion. He once told his students, "We are never more like Christ than when we comfort the weary." That line became the banner of his ministry's second half: not repent or perish, but come and rest. Not because holiness mattered less, but because he had discovered that love is what makes holiness possible. The God who once hid his voice had given him a new one, not a roar, but a whisper strong enough to shake the world. In the next part, we'll see how this revival touched not just churches, but culture, how Spurgeon's renewed faith transformed London's soul, and how the echo of a quiet fire still burns more than a century later. London had never seen light like this. The city that once laughed at preachers now leaned in to listen. The smoke of factories mixed with the fragrance of prayer. The same streets that echoed with drunken songs now carried hymns whispered through alleys. Something unseen was moving through the veins of the city. Quiet, wholly unstoppable. Spurgeon's voice, once thunderous from the pulpit, now spread in softer ways, through printed sermons carried by trains, through letters shared in factories, through the quiet testimony of changed lives. The revival that began as a whisper had escaped the tabernacle and entered the bloodstream of a weary metropolis. He used to say, "If a man truly burns for God, his fire will find its way into the street." And it did. The cab drivers repeated his quotes. Factory workers recited his prayers. Families read his sermons aloud at dinner tables. His words were no longer just preaching, they were bread for the poor, medicine for the broken, oxygen for the hopeless. And yet, Spurgeon never claimed it as success. "This," he said, "is not the preacher's doing. It is the echo of God's mercy in a city that forgot to listen." That was the secret. What the world saw as influence, heaven saw as overflow. The fire that God lit in silence had found fuel in suffering people. Hospitals received anonymous donations signed simply "a debtor to grace." Prisons reported a strange calm among inmates after reading his tracts. Orphanages, once overlooked, became centers of compassion, funded by believers, stirred through his sermons. It wasn't just religion that changed, it was conscience. London began to soften. The same industrial heart that pulsed with greed and exhaustion started to beat again with humanity. The rich heard the cry of the poor. The intellectuals who mocked faith began quoting Spurgeon's aphorisms. The skeptics who dismissed miracles could not deny mercy. And through it all, Spurgeon kept pointing away from himself. "When God hides his servants," he said, "it is only to reveal his Son." That was his secret power, anonymity in glory. Every fire that reached another soul was a spark from Calvary, not from the man. He often preached that true revival begins not in the crowd, but in the conscience. And London's conscience had begun to wake up. No political reform, no grand speech, no worldly campaign could have done what one broken preacher's obedience did. Because cities are not changed by strategies, they are changed by saints who carry fire. The city that once wounded him now became his mission field. Spurgeon poured himself into it like oil into a lamp. He founded orphanages, schools, and the famous pastor's college to train others to burn. He never wanted to be the only flame. A fire confined, he said, is a fire dying. So he multiplied himself, not through fame, but through faithfulness. Thousands of ministers left his training, carrying the same tone of tenderness that silence had taught him. The revival had become generational. But more than institutions, what Spurgeon left behind was atmosphere. The sense that God could still move, even in a modern world of steam and steel. That holiness wasn't outdated. That compassion wasn't weakness. That truth, when spoken with tears, still has power. Visitors to London in those years described something intangible, as if the air itself carried conviction. The revival that whispered had become the conscience of a city. And though time has buried the buildings and silenced the voices, the embers remain. You can still feel them in every soul who reads his words and senses what Spurgeon sensed, that the greatest sound in the world is not thunder, but grace quietly setting hearts on fire, because what began as one man's silence had become a city's song. In the next part, we'll see how that song outlived him, how Spurgeon's final years, though marked by frailty, became a living sermon about finishing the race in faith, and how the flame he carried refused to die even when his voice did. The years began to press on Spurgeon like weight upon a bridge that had carried too much. The body that once stood like a pillar behind the pulpit now shook under pain. His hands trembled when he lifted his Bible. His heart, worn thin by decades of preaching, began to falter, yet the fire would not die. He often said, "When I can no longer speak with my lips, may my eyes preach Christ." And they did. Even in illness, even in weakness, the flame still flickered, not in noise, but in glow. His congregation began to notice something almost supernatural about him. The weaker his body grew, the stronger his presence became. The fire that once filled auditoriums now radiated from his frailty. His suffering had become its own sermon. He would limp into the tabernacle, leaning on his cane, and the people would rise, not to applaud, but to weep. Because they knew this was what endurance looked like when it refused to surrender. Spurgeon's last years were not marked by expansion but by essence. He no longer built, he burned as quietly, steadily, faithfully. He was a preacher of twilight, a man who glowed as the sun went down. He wrote fewer books, but each word seemed carved from eternity. He preached fewer sermons, but each carried eternity's echo. The silence that had once broken him had now become his rhythm. He no longer feared the dark. He had learned to walk with it. He would tell his students, "When you cannot see his hand, trust his heart." That sentence became the compass of his final decade, a creed forged in both fire and frost. In those years, his pulpit became his hospital, his church became his family, and his God became his only audience. He would preach until pain forced him to stop, then rest for weeks, only to return with the same sentence. "If I can but speak one more word of Christ, I shall count the suffering as nothing." That's what love looks like when it outlasts comfort. The city watched him fade, but heaven watched him finish. The preacher who once roared now whispered, and yet that whisper carried the full authority of a lifetime, refined by silence. It was no longer the man speaking. It was the message itself. He had become what he preached, an altar that burned until nothing was left but glory. Even from his sickbed, letters poured from his hand, counsel to pastors, prayers for the suffering, encouragements to the doubting. Every sentence seemed dipped in eternity. He wrote as though time was closing and grace was all that remained. He no longer fought the frailty, he befriended it. "Every weakness," he said, "is another reminder that the strength was never mine." The people feared the day he would stop preaching, but Spurgeon had already made peace with that. "When I can no longer serve from the pulpit," he said, "I will serve from the pillow." And he did. The tabernacle began sending his words through print and telegram to churches across the world. His last sermons reached further than his voice ever had, proof that God doesn't need movement to make impact. His faith had become still, but it had not become small. Those who visited him in those final years often left trembling. They came to comfort him and left convicted, because his room felt like the edge of eternity, quiet, holy, luminous. He was no longer afraid of the silence. He had discovered that it was simply the sound of heaven getting closer. The same God who had hidden his voice in youth now drew near in whispers of peace. And as his fire began to dim on earth, it was not extinguished, it was being transferred. In the next part, we'll witness the closing act. The night Spurgeon's flame left this world and entered eternity, and how his death became a continuation of his sermon. The fire never died, it simply went home. It was a quiet evening in Menton, on the southern coast of France. The sea outside his window shimmered with the last light of day. Inside, the Prince of Preachers lay still. His body was failing, but his spirit had never been stronger. Those who stood beside him that night said there was no fear in his face, only peace. The man who had spent a lifetime preaching heaven was now walking into it. His last days were not filled with regret or ambition, but with worship. He spoke often of Jesus and almost never of himself. Even as his breath grew shallow, he whispered prayers for others, his students, his congregation, his beloved wife. "Christ is all," he murmured, again and again. Christ is all. The silence that had once haunted him had now become home. The God who had hidden his voice for a season now filled the room with presence. There were no angels visible, no sound of choirs, only the stillness that every saint recognizes, the nearness of glory. Spurgeon's final sermon was not preached from a pulpit, but from a pillow. His last words were not directed to crowds, but to Christ. Those in the room said it felt like watching a candle go out, not in darkness, but in dawn. The flame did not die. It simply moved to a brighter place. The man who had carried fire through decades of storms now returned it to the one who first lit it. He was 57. When the news reached London, the city froze. Thousands poured into the streets. Businesses closed. Black cloth draped the doors of the tabernacle. People wept openly, and rich and poor, believers and skeptics alike. The same city that had once mocked him now mourned him. It wasn't the death of a celebrity, it was the passing of a light. Newspapers across Europe carried his words, not as quotations but as confessions. One paper wrote, "We may disagree with his creed, but not with his Christ." Even atheists bowed their heads. During the memorial service, the church overflowed. Voices that had once debated doctrine now joined in hymns. As his coffin passed through the streets, crowds whispered his favorite phrase, "Look unto me, and be ye saved." That was Spurgeon's first sermon text, Isaiah 45:22, and now it became his epitaph. He had spent a lifetime pointing men toward the cross. Now, even in death, his finger still pointed upward. The silence he once feared had become the song of his eternity. In heaven's timeline, it was never silence, it was a symphony being tuned. And now the conductor had lifted his hand. The preacher who once declared that to die is gain had discovered how true it was. Spurgeon's body was buried in Norwood Cemetery, beneath the shade of trees, surrounded by the city he had loved. His grave bore a simple inscription, "I know whom I have believed." Nothing more needed to be said, because the sermon was over, but the echo remained. And the fire he carried still flickers in the pages of his sermons, in the pulpits of his students, in the prayers of those who still find hope in his words. The flame refused to die, it simply changed homes. That's how God writes his stories. He hides the fire in silence, refines it in suffering, reveals it in mercy, and receives it in glory. Spurgeon's death was not an ending, it was a transfer. The altar on earth had burned to its final ember, and the altar in heaven ignited with eternal flame. And somewhere, beyond sound and time, the God who once went silent finally spoke again. "Well done, good and faithful servant." In the final part, we'll reflect on what Spurgeon's silent years mean for us, how to live faithfully in the seasons when God hides his voice, and how every believer can become a living sermon, a flame that burns quietly but never goes out. Silence was never Spurgeon's defeat. It was his discipleship, and now, more than a century later, his story still speaks to those who walk through the same shadow, believers who pray and hear nothing, who serve and feel unseen, who wonder if heaven has forgotten their name. But silence is not the sound of absence. It is the sound of shaping. The God who hid his voice from Spurgeon still hides his voice from us for the same reason, to teach us faith that no noise can sustain, because true faith is not born from what you hear, but from what you refuse to stop believing when you hear nothing at all. Spurgeon's life proves it. The seasons when God is most silent are the seasons when he is most near. He does his deepest work in the dark, unseen, unspoken, but undeniable. The fire that burned in him did not begin in sermons or crowds. It began in quiet rooms filled with tears. And that same fire is available to us if we dare to enter the same silence. When the prayers seem unanswered, stay. When the worship feels empty, stay. When the Bible feels closed, stay. Because silence is not a door shutting, it is a seed waiting. The Spirit does not waste stillness. He turns every unanswered prayer into an altar, every quiet season into a classroom, every delay into design. And when the time is right, the voice returns, not as echo, but as encounter. That is what Spurgeon's journey teaches, that the absence of sound can become the birthplace of substance. He once said, "If I cannot trace his hand, I will trust his heart." That sentence has become the anthem for every generation of the waiting faithful. It is not resignation, it is revelation. It is the knowledge that silence does not mean rejection, but refinement. The God who hides his voice is the same God who hid his Son in a tomb, not to end the story, but to prepare resurrection. Every believer who has walked through a silent heaven stands in holy company. Moses waited 40 years. David sang through sleepless nights. Elijah hid in caves. Jesus himself prayed in Gethsemane and heard no answer until the cross. The silence of God is not the absence of love. It is the proving of it. Spurgeon's faith survived because it was anchored not in the sound of God, but in the character of God. And that is the kind of faith that lasts. Faith that trusts when logic fails, that worships when emotion dies, that believes when everything feels broken. We often beg God to speak, but sometimes his silence is the greater mercy. Because when he withholds his voice, he removes the noise of everything else. And only then do we hear what has always been speaking, his presence. So if you are living your own silent years, take heart. The same God who shaped Spurgeon in the shadows is shaping you now. He is not punishing you, he is preparing you. The silence will not last forever. But when it ends, you will not be the same. Your voice will be humbler, your love will be deeper, your fire will be real, and the world will feel the difference. Because revival doesn't begin with noise. It begins with a whisper that refuses to die. Spurgeon's fire still burns because it was born in silence. It was not borrowed, it was built. It was not taught, it was tested. It was not loud, it was lasting. And that is your call too. When God hides his voice, don't stop listening. When he withholds the fire, don't stop building the altar. When he closes the heavens, don't close your heart. The same God who was faithful in Spurgeon's silence will be faithful in yours. Because he has never stopped speaking. He has only changed the volume. If this message found you in your own season of silence, tell us in the comments what city and country you're watching from. Your testimony might become someone else's spark. Share this video with someone who feels forgotten by heaven, and subscribe to this channel for more sermons that awaken, confront, and restore your faith in the God who still speaks, even when he whispers. May you carry Spurgeon's fire into your own silence until the quiet